Hello guys, this is your friend Shinobi Nexus 2.0 and we are back in new fanfic. What if Naruto confronted the darkness within part 2? Naruto sat a few meters ahead of his sensei, waiting for his evaluation of where he had gone wrong in his first attempt at AD rank missions. He was unusually attentive, considering his knowledge that a lecture from Jiraiya was imminent, however the memory of firstly, his failure, and also that of what the failure would have meant in a real mission. His comrades, possibly even a friend, would have been killed as a direct result of his decisions. Because of his prisoner, he had grown up alone. Other children were told to keep away from him by their parents and carers, and they listened obediently. He had never harbored any resentment towards the children, nor their parents. He had always assumed that it was simply because of something he, or his parents had done, if he even had parents, of course. Even now, when he had at least some of the answers, he found that he didn't hate the parents or children for their actions. Indeed, having come face to face with the Kyuubi no Kitsune himself, he found that he understood the fears of the village perfectly. However, regardless of this, the damage had been done to Naruto's psyche. His facade was already firmly set into place by the time he had entered the academy, and to everyone within, he was an eternally loud and happy-go-lucky, dead last. Ironically, looking back, it was his method of coping with his own loneliness that destroyed any chance of him making friends during his time there. The children belonging to some of the major clans, he realized, held no ill will to him whatsoever. But despite this, the blonde had found himself to drop his mask. And this inevitably put the others off. Of course there were some that didn't outright dislike him. Nara Shikamaru seemed eternally curious and did actually speak to him every now and again, and by association, he also spent some time with Akamichi Choji, who was Shikamaru's best friend. As well as those two, Inuzuka Kiba seemed to appreciate the art of pranking, almost as much as he did. But he would never go as far as to call any of them friends. As a result, a friend was something he had wanted for as long as he could remember. He of course had precious people now. Iruka, Jiraiya, the Sandaime and even Yugo, were all utterly precious to him. But they weren't friends as such. They were more like family to him. So to him, the mistake he had made was crushing. Jiraiya observed his student as he became absorbed in his own internal monologue. It was evident that the blonde had taken the implications of his exercise to hear, which was pleasing as the Sannin had initially been worried that Naruto would not take things seriously. Conversely, Jiraiya did not want his student to be too immersed, as it were, as that could tear apart Naruto's confidence, which wasn't as high as Naruto would like people to believe. Firstly, I would like to make it clear that you were not expected to succeed in that mission, Naruto. In fact, generally I will be endeavoring to cause you to make mistakes, and sometimes fail as a result. He observed the familiar confused look on Naruto's face, before continuing in order to cut off the inevitable questioning. The reason for this is that it allows you to learn from the mistakes that you do make. If I allowed everything to go to plan for you all the time, it would not punish any errors in your decision-making and planning. Learning from actually seeing the consequences of your mistakes, and making changes to your strategy accordingly, is an infinitely better way to learn than me simply telling you where you went wrong. So with that in mind, what do you think went wrong in the exercise we just did? Naruto didn't need to think before answering. I sent my Bunshin ahead by themselves, whilst I was still fighting your Bunshin. That was indeed the most glaring issue. The fact is, you had no real need to do it. I understand that you wanted to keep the cargo out of the way of the battle, but you had my Bunshin on the ropes. It didn't pose a serious enough threat to the mission. As a result, you were separated from them. And as a result, you could not relay vital information about further danger. However, it is important for you to understand that some situations will call for that kind of action. If the enemy was powerful enough, sending some of your party onwards in the hope of giving them a chance of fulfilling the mission's objective, is the only option. However, it is a last resort option. It is a strategy that acknowledges that those left behind will be defeated, and therefore sacrificed for the good of the mission, as well as the safety of their comrades. Jiraiya saw the mix of understanding and determination on his student's face, and smiled. It was a familiar scene to him. His father had been exactly the same when he failed his first D rank, distraught at first, but utterly determined to improve, and ensure that when he did lead a squad into combat, he wouldn't lose any of his comrades. Of course, life doesn't always play fair, and even the best laid plans could be unraveled. But that was not a lesson that could be taught, it could only be learned through experience. Having said that, Jiraiya continued, there wasn't much else wrong with how you worked. The only fault I can find is with the bunshin you deployed underground. Whilst the idea in itself was pretty ingenious, there is a large risk attached to that particular tactic. During the fight, you allowed me to get between you and your bunshin, leaving it isolated. Had I allowed myself to raise my game, that would be another teammate dead. Of course, there would be nothing wrong with you using a clone to do that on a real mission. You certainly have the chakra for it, and the cage bunshin are, to some extent, expendable. As Jiraiya finished, he fished around in his pocket to produce the map he had used to give Naruto his route. Now, I want to spend a bit of time working through different ways you could have approached that particular mission. That way, you have a variety of different ways of approaching different situations at hand. Hours had passed, and Jiraiya was absolutely delighted with the way his session on tactics with Naruto had gone. Largely, Jiraiya had allowed Naruto to plan independently, and then he would point out faults and problems with what the blonde had come up with, so he could find a way around the problem. The Sannin found himself incredibly surprised with Naruto's intuitive grasp of strategy. He did have a tendency to overlook minor issues, but that was something that could be improved through practice and experience, two things Jiraiya could help Naruto attain. He glanced towards the sky, trying to work out the time from the position of the sun. It had been overcast for a few hours, and it would probably rain in the night, and for someone of lesser ability, judging the position of the sun in such condition would have been a difficult task. Fortunately, Jiraiya had spent most of his later years living under an open sky, traveling between the various informants that made up his spy network. This level of experience meant that he only needed a small glance to see that it was late afternoon. They had been talking for far too long, and Jiraiya needed to speak to the Sandaime fairly early. Especially if he wanted to get some research in. Okay, listen up, Gaki. Naruto immediately turned his attention from the map of Konoha to Jiraiya. We're gonna have to call it quits for today. I have some business I need to attend to. As if Arrow Sennin, you're just gonna go and do your research. Jiraiya gave an involuntary flinch at both his nickname, and the fact that the boy was almost spot on with his predictions. For your information, Gaki, I have a meeting with the Hokage. Yeah, for about 5 minutes, and then it's time for some quality research. But first, I need to explain to you how training is going to work under me. I want you here at 6 a.m. every single morning except for Wednesdays and Saturdays. We will spend the first 3 hours working over anything that doesn't involve large amounts of physical work. For example, things such as strategy, ninjutsu theory, and eventually, things such as sealing techniques and working on chakra mastery, which I know you've already spoken about with Yugo. The rest of the day will change depending on the activities of the other genin cells, which makes it tricky to schedule properly. However, you will always do at least one D rank independently, and one with one of the other cells. The rest of the day will be spent on the fun stuff. We will be working on taijutsu and ninjutsu, as well as improving your ability to counter genjutsu. Any questions? What will I be doing on Wednesdays and Saturdays? At this, Jiraiya smirked slightly. Well, on those days, you'll be doing weapons training with Yugo. The next day, Naruto finished the relatively short sequence of hand seals and brought his right hand up to his mouth, with his index and middle fingers extended in front of him. He then exhaled heavily, expelling the chakra he had been molding at the back of his throat, and combining it with the chakra gathered at the end of his fingers. Kaden. Kasumi Endo no Jutsu. The result was a light mist billowing out from his mouth, filling the majority of the clearing before him. It wasn't heavy enough to obscure his vision, yet it was still thick enough to be clearly visible. Yes, I finally did it, Naruto exclaimed, the excitement in his voice clearly audible. About time too, Yaki. That's a totally basic technique, the easiest of the ones I want to get you practicing today. Naruto looked up at surprise at this statement. You mean this isn't the only jutsu I'm going to be learning today? Of course not. I don't know if you noticed, but this jutsu isn't particularly useful by itself. I'll be teaching you 3 more jutsu today. One of which you should have down by the time we're finished. The other 2, however, might take you a few days, if we work at them intensely enough. The blonde struggled to contain his excitement at hearing this. No matter how much he tried to be more serious about his shinobi training, the thought of ninjutsu still sent him overboard. However, I first want you to join me up here. The Sannin continued, indicating his position in the tree overlooking the clearing. I'm going to show you exactly how powerful this technique can be. Naruto was up and sitting next to Jiraiya almost instantly, allowing Jiraiya to start weaving his own set of hand signs. Kaden. Komakai Kaki. Jiraiya fired a miniature version of the Gukakyu no Jutsu directly towards the mist that Naruto had created, and the blonde looked on, curious as to what effect the seemingly tiny fireball could possibly have. Naruto leant forward in fascination as the fireball approached the mist. As the 2 jutsu finally met, the area the pair had been training in was swept by an unbearable wave of heat, as the mist ignited upon contact, transforming the previously placid area of Konoha into a tangible inferno. Naruto, although not being within the blast radius itself, could feel the hairs on his arms singe from merely the heat created, and despite only seconds passing, he was already beginning to sweat. Amazing, Naruto muttered, as the roaring flames died down, leaving behind the scorched earth as evidence of their existence. Glad you liked it, Jiraiya replied, the smugness generated by the blonde praise emanating from him in waves. But can you tell me why that jutsu combination is entirely useless in a practical combat situation? Naruto was initially dumbstruck by Jiraiya adamantly that such a powerful attack was useless. However, once he got round to actually think about it, it didn't take him long to see what his sensei was talking about. Firstly, it would be too slow to activate in a fight against another shinobi. They would just try to get out of the mist, considering that it doesn't cover a particularly large area, or at least disguise how much of an area it does cover. Secondly, it would be difficult for you to use the Kaden Jutsu without getting caught in the blast radius. It also puts any comrades in the vicinity at risk. That's exactly correct, Jiraiya answered, ever so slightly impressed with the improved analytical skills his student was displaying. It was obvious that he had been studying outside of what he had been required to do to catch up. So why have me learn it then? Naruto called back, almost whining. He had spent a good few hours learning the mist technique, and he'd be damned if it was for nothing. The reason I taught you Kaden, Kasumi Endo no Jutsu, and am about to teach you Kaden, Komakai Kaki no Jutsu is threefold. Firstly, Kasumi Endo teaches you to mold Kaden chakra from within your lungs, which is what ignites when you use all Kaden jutsu. Then, Kamaka Kaki will teach you to ignite the chakra using the correct hand seal whilst maintaining enough control so that you do not burn your own mouth. This hand seal is what is missing from the mist technique, preventing it from igniting as it leaves your body. Essentially, this is a far safer and faster way of learning to use Kaden chakra, which is notoriously difficult to handle if it is not your natural elemental affinity. This means that you will be able to learn the third of the jutsu I wish to get you started on today, Kaden, Gukakyu no Jutsu, relatively easily. Secondly, this combination can be useful in select situations. Due to the fact that Kasumi Endo, providing it is not ignited, can last for a relatively long time, it can be used to set up particularly devastating ambushes, if you can funnel your enemy into the mist. It can also be used to destroy areas containing multiple structures and buildings, should your mission require it. Thirdly, I wanted to give you an example of exactly how powerful combinations of different elemental jutsu can be, which leads you into the final technique I want to get you practicing today, Fuden, Daitapa. Naruto almost cried out in excitement as he leapt down from the trees, into the barren clearing below, that now looked startlingly out of place amidst the vivid green of Konoha. Jiraiya leapt with him, landing just in front of the boy, so that he was facing him. He formed the ream seal with his hands and created 2 kage bunshin. Okay, I want you to create 2 groups of 5 bunshin, and each group join up with one of mine. One group will work on Kamaka Kai, and the other will work on Fuden, Daitapa. Gukakyu no Jutsu can wait until you have completely learned Kamaka Kai. I want the original over with me, we're going to work on your taijutsu. The next day, Shikamaru wasn't nearly as stupid as his relatively poor grades at the academy, and even his overall demeanor would suggest to someone who didn't actually know him. Outwardly, he was lazy and entirely unimpressive. He was the epitome of average, and he endeavored to ensure that he stayed that way in the opinions of others. That way, he would never have to exert himself. He could just waste his days away, doing low-risk, low-effort missions, gazing at the clouds and playing shogi. However, he was sure he had already managed to give away to his Jonin sensei, Sarutobi Asuma, a chain-smoking shinobi, who as well as possessing a fairly keen mind himself, as most Jonin surely did, of course was also built like a fortress, meaning it was safe to assume he was also a combat expert, that he possessed the potential to be something other than ordinary. His 2 teammates, Akamichi Choji and Yamanaka, had surely already demonstrated enough in the few training exercises they had done, to indicate they had the promise to reach the heights that their fathers had before them. Choji was already apt in his family's taijutsu style, and could perform several of his family's personal just-yu with skill rarely equated with someone below the rank of Chunin. Ino, too, had mastered a few of her clan's ninjutsu, which focused on the manipulation of the mind. The temperamental blonde combined this with extraordinary ability to psychoanalyze somebody, whilst holding a conversation with the person, simultaneously. He had decided that he would try to make out that he had no real potential whatsoever, by only ever doing what his sensei deemed as the bare minimum to get by. Unfortunately, Asuma had discovered enough to convince himself that Shikamaru had enough potential to be as successful as his father, by attacking his only weak spot. He had challenged him to a game of shogi, and thus ensued what could be described as an epic match. It had lasted for 3.5 hours, and eventually the Nara had won out. He had been so engaged in the game, that he had failed to realize his mistake until his sensei spoke. Not as average as you'd like to make out. Shikamaru. He was of course right. Nara Shikamaru, all forms of bragging aside, possessed an incredibly keen mind. Speaking from a shugi perspective, his mind could work 3 or 4 steps ahead of most adults almost instantaneously. Thoroughly analyzing every possible move that could be made, constructing a counter move for each, and working out the possible consequences of that particular move. And, as his father had drilled into him from an early age, this would translate to the battlefield. And much like his teammates, he could demonstrate an impressive level of mastery over his clan's techniques as well. And it was down to his impressive intellect, that when he received a cursory glance from Ino, he knew they were both on precisely the same wavelength. His team had taken one of the obligatory D-rank missions, Ino often referred to them, and rightly so, as slave labor, that all genin completed before they took on more challenging C-rank missions. The exceptional thing about this particular mission, was that they were being accompanied by one, Uzumaki Naruto, a former academy classmate, who had not been appointed to a team. Instead, he had been apprenticed to an unknown ninja, which according to his father, was not particularly unusual amongst graduates with exceptional potential. Indeed, the Yondaime Hokage was apprenticed to a student of the Sandaime, Jiraiya of the Sannin, shortly after graduating. The problem the Nara had was that his classmate had shown absolutely no potential during his time at the academy. In fact, Shikamaru had absolutely no idea how the blonde had managed to graduate at all, although he suspected it had something to do with the fact that the team assignments had been set back by 4 weeks. That was not all. Naruto had always been a topic of heavy discussion between himself and his teammate Ino. Despite public indifference towards Naruto, the pair had taken somewhat of a scientific interest in him. He had confused the two of them from the moment they had met, Ino especially, as she prided herself on the ability to read people's intentions and emotions. Quite simply, they found him to be unreadable. He had an outward appearance of wearing his emotions on his sleeve, and was constantly loud, energetic, and had a permanent grin plastered to his face. Everyone else took that to be Naruto's true personality, and disregarded him because of it. Shikamaru himself had been guilty of this too. In fact, it was Ino that eventually indicated that something might be awry. It was around a year and a half into their time at the academy that he and Ino first spoke about the blonde. She had just begun training with her family on manipulation of the human mind that could be done without the use of jutsu, and she had been practicing using what she had learned on their classmates, trying to pinpoint whether they were lying, and how they truly felt over what they were actually saying, or how they were acting. She almost didn't even bother trying this with Naruto, under the notion that as he was so open and honest, he probably wasn't hiding anything. On hindsight, there was probably a lesson to be learned for everyone learning to be a ninja. Never disregard anything based on outward appearances. Ino did in fact try her technique on Naruto, more out of boredom than anything else. In doing so sparked one of the most interesting topics of conversation the three teammates had ever shared, and just about one of the only mysteries that Shikamaru hadn't been able to solve. Because, when Ino tried to read the rambunctious blonde's true thoughts, she found nothing. Not a single scrap of emotion, not even what one could witness on the outside. There was no trace of what the blonde really thought or felt, other than what came from his mouth. Ino described it as like being whitewashed. Initially, Shikamaru believed that this was because Naruto was simply completely earnest in his thoughts. However, Ino claimed that if that was true, his thoughts would echo his actions. However, instead it was some kind of invisible wall that stopped Ino from reading him. It took another 3 months before the trio got any further with the mystery. Ino tried to use her techniques on her own father as practice, and was met with precisely the same reaction. She was whitewashed, so to speak. Naturally, Ino questioned this instantly. Apparently, it was something almost everybody who was a shinobi for more than a few years developed. An outwards personality, or a mask, that they always wore as a coping mechanism for the stresses the life of a ninja could bring. It was virtually impossible to look beyond, apart from by people who have this mechanism themselves. This was also another reason why anyone who wishes to become part of the torture and interrogation department has to have served in Anbu for more than a year. It would be impossible for anyone be part of Anbu for any length of time without using it to help them cope. Unfortunately, this only brought more questions. What could possibly have affected Naruto, on a similar level to being a member of Anbu? They knew he was an orphan, but there had been other orphans in their graduating class, and Ino could read all of them. What was different about Naruto? Today was different. Ino had taught both himself and Choji the basics of reading people, and they had both become pretty good at it, for their age anyway. So, when Naruto joined them to perform their mission, Shikamaru decided to try to apply what he had learnt. Unfortunately, he was whitewashed, and made no further progress. However, about half an hour later something happened. Flashback. Shikamaru groaned loudly, as he watched Naruto stumble down the ladder that he had been climbing, attempting to reach a higher portion of the wall he had been painting. They had been assigned to paint an old man's house, a very rude old man, going by the reaction the four of them got when they knocked to announce their arrival. He seemed to glare at them, for no reason whatsoever, and only stopped when Asuma announced his presence. When they had been shown what they were to paint, Naruto immediately and enthusiastically set to work, like something possessed. Shikamaru noted that while he couldn't tell what Naruto was really thinking, his over-exuberance was particularly forced today, like he wasn't comfortable. He also saw, whilst the blonde was desperately trying to wipe paint off of his now spoiled orange jumpsuit, that he had purposefully avoided conversation with any of Team 10, speaking only when it was absolutely necessary to do so, in order not to arouse suspicion. Naruto loudly cursed both his luck and the paint, despite the fact that it was his own clumsiness that was at fault. That was when it happened. A man appeared in a loud puff of smoke, and picked Naruto up by the collar of his jumpsuit, and put him back down, standing up. He was an incredibly odd-looking man, with incredibly long, spiky white hair, and a headband with kanji inscribed on it. Whatever it said, Shikamaru couldn't read it from where he was standing, which replaced the symbol of Konoha. Which seemed incredibly strange to the Nara, considering exactly who the man was. Jiraiya of the Sannin, student of the Sandaime, the man who trained the Yondaime, and probably the most powerful ninja the village had to offer, the Hokage aside. This of course, meant that Jiraiya, the man who had trained Namikaze Minato, the single most feared ninja of that generation, had hand-picked Naruto to become his apprentice. More questions. This is so troublesome. Naruto, you need to stop this, there's no need for you to keep it up anymore. Naruto himself didn't answer, and simply avoided Jiraiya's eyes, his facial features contorted into an unusual mixture of sullenness and frustration. Jiraiya simply sighed at Naruto's reaction, and placed his left hand firmly on the blonde's shoulder, and glanced sideways at Asuma, who had been watching over the genin's progress. I need to speak to my student, do you mind if I take him off your hands for a few minutes? Asuma simply nodded in response, as the two vanished in another puff of smoke, the same way in which Jiraiya had arrived. Flashback. It had been over 20 minutes since Naruto had gone, and Ino was beginning to get ever so slightly unnerved. She had never been a friend of his, but they were both at the academy, and they were comrades. And whilst she did find him perpetually irritating, the fact that she was aware that his behavior could be a veil for something else, prevented her dislike for him reaching the levels of vehemence that Sakura, among others, tended to show towards him. He felt sorry for him, in that respect, as no matter how much affection he showered her with, it was really quite coldly rejected, more because of Sakura's own insecurity, than anything else. She was not rejecting Naruto, so much as rejecting the notion that she was worth such adulation from anyone. That was one of the reasons she was so set on Sasuke. The fact that he practically ignored her, confirmed her own evaluations of her own self-worth. Of course, that naturally didn't justify the way she treated Naruto. Ino herself could be particularly mean to him when he was at his most annoying, but Sakura seemed to go out of her way to either hit him, or make him feel miserable. That brought her back to her original train of thought. Naruto, today, she was damn good at reading people, it was one of the things she took pride in the most. And, despite that, for as long as she'd known him, Naruto had always been a complete enigma. However, already in the short time they had been together, the veil surrounding the blonde had begun to crack, and hints of the real Naruto could be glimpsed beyond. It was only ever at choice moments, only every now and again could a slight hint of his true emotions could be seen, if only for a fleeting moment. Until Jiraiya came. Then the mask cracked enough to be able to make out what was beyond it. Ino couldn't decipher what it was though, however familiar it felt. But it was eerily reminiscent of a feeling she knew intimately, yet at the same time could not identify exactly what it was. But what she did know, was that it was not an emotion that she enjoyed at all, and the enormity of what Naruto felt far eclipsed her personal experiences of it. It made her feel sick. She now knew with every fiber of her being that Naruto, for years, had needed help. Help that had never arrived. Suddenly, there was a clang coming from Shikamaru's direction, as he dropped his can of paint. Ino turned towards him, shaken from her musings by the loud noise, only to be met with the Nara staring, slightly slack-jawed, in the direction of the gate to the house they were working on. Following Shikamaru's line of sight, she looked towards whatever had given him such surprise, and very nearly dropped her own can of paint. It was Naruto, and it was a Naruto almost completely different from what they were used to. Gone was the heinous orange jumpsuit. In its place, was what Ino felt assured was proper shinobi attire. He was wearing standard shinobi combats, complete with 3 different hip-worn holsters, which in itself was unusual. He also wore a black shinobi shirt, tied off with bandages that ran entirely along his forearm, but such minor detail was entirely overpowered by what Ino would call the centerpiece of his outfit. It was some kind of armor, but she hadn't ever seen anything like it. It was a deep red, and clearly made out of the same stern material that Anbu armor was created with, yet it covered more of his body, and looked to still retain flexibility. However, that his clothing was relatively unimportant, in comparison to the difference in Naruto's outward personality. Gone was the faked exuberance and wide plastered-on grin. Standing before Team 10 was an entirely different animal. He was nervous for a start, eyeing each of them desperately, attempting to gauge reaction. Ino wanted to say he looked shy, but that wasn't exactly right. He seemed to crave acceptance from them, as if he thought that showing a different side of his personality, his true self, would warrant instant rejection. It was completely alien to Ino, to be able to associate such a feeling from Naruto. He was clearly petrified of a rejection that he perceived as inevitable, and it was clear that he had been at least somewhat coerced into showing a more honest self to them. It also made her cast her mind back to her time at the academy. What if Naruto had been like this underneath, all this time? How exactly did all those times he was rebuked in offers of friendship, or just plain ignored all those times he was laughed at and insulted, how exactly did that make him feel? Once again, Ino found herself feeling queasy, as though she knew the answer through experience, yet couldn't somehow relate the experience to herself. Shikamaru, of course, was thinking miles ahead of her, and had already gathered his own thoughts enough to figure out how to react to this new Naruto. Whoa, Naruto, that looks pretty good, makes a nice change from that troublesome bright orange, you know. Shikamaru glanced back at Ino once again, prompting her to try and speak up in support. She looked at Naruto, who was eyeing Shikamaru with a mixture of a kind of guarded, delighted surprise, and suspicion. Almost as though wanted to believe the Nara, but couldn't quite bring himself to do so. Yeah, Naruto, that armor looks really cool. It must have cost quite a lot. She added, relatively honestly. He did look pretty cool. Not on the same level as Sasuke, obviously, but cool nonetheless. Naruto simply regarded Ino in shock, obviously not expecting a compliment from someone who was so infatuated with Sasuke. Choji didn't allow Naruto much time to think about it, however. Where did you get that kind of armor from, Naruto? It reminds me of the Akamichi family armor. It's really impressive. Naruto rubbed the back of his head with a kind of embarrassed pleasure, which worried Ino more than she would usually care to admit. Who gets so flustered over such small compliments? They hadn't really been any more complimentary than what was polite, when talking to someone who has bought new clothes. It didn't sit well with her that he was so shocked by their words, and so elated that they were complimentary. It was made in Konoha, but the design actually comes from Uzushiogakure, a village we used to be allies with, before the Kyuubi destroyed it. It's pretty rare to have any armor like this still around, so it was really lucky for me to find it, even though I didn't know how rare it was at the time. The blonde spoke with massive enthusiasm still, but Ino couldn't help but notice that everything that he said now sounded a lot more earnest than it did when it was laced in that, over-the-top half-shout, that she remembered his voice being. They were seeing the real Naruto. That's incredibly interesting and everything, but perhaps it would be a better idea to hold the history lesson after you've finished here. Apparently, They had all forgotten about the presence of Team 10's sensei, Asuma. But with a grumble, that impressively was in unison, the four got back to their previous work. Although now, they conversed whilst they worked, with Naruto now being far more open with the three of them. And the day continued like this for another 2 hours, the genin finishing the man's house, and moving on to another mission, this time walking some of the Inuzuka dogs. All the while, they talked about their time since the genin exam, and their experiences now that they were genin. However, despite Naruto's much more open nature, Ino still couldn't help but feel that there was something about him that she had missed. She couldn't quite place it, and every time she tried, an uncomfortable sense of familiarity arose. What she did know, however, was that whenever she got close to the answer, she felt sick to the stomach. Naruto couldn't keep the grin off of his face as he opened the door to Training Ground 56, the secret training area he and Yugo-sensei would be using to learn how to use a weapon. He couldn't believe how well things had gone, once Jiraiya had convinced him to drop the act. He was terrified that he would be rejected if he acted normally, but he needn't have worried. Team 10 were far friendlier than he remembered anyone his own age being to him, ever. It was weird to be able to just talk to someone, the way they had during the D-rank missions, and the experience was enough to convince him to act normally around everyone, from now on. He even dared to hope that at some point they would be willing to call themselves his friends, as alien a concept as that was to him, just the possibility alone thrilled him. The only people he was still apprehensive about meeting were Sakura and Sasuke, especially Sakura. But he could cross that bridge when he came to it. To top that off, today he was going to start learning to use a weapon. Since he was a small child, he had dreams of using a katana, or something equally as awesome, so the thought of actually getting the opportunity to learn to use one was exciting, to say the least. He passed through the doorway, into the main area of the training ground, and was greeted by the sight of Yugo, standing behind a table complete with her usual serene smile. However, the rest of her was inherently different. Before, she had been wearing a plain black kimono, with the brilliant white grip of her katana still visible over her shoulder. Today, she was dressed as though she meant business. She wore skin-tight black shorts that went down to knee height, and on either thigh, kunai holsters were tied on with bandages. On her torso, she wore a long dark red coat with a high neck, that whilst being done up on her upper torso, was undone on her lower half, allowing the coat to flow around her, as well as exposing her stomach. Her katana's grip was visible above her right shoulder as always, however now, she had second at her left hip, its grip the same brilliant white as the first. All in all, it was an entirely different Yugo from what Naruto had previously seen either in training, or when she was on duty with Anbu. It was the table in front of his sensei that really got Naruto excited, though. It was littered with broad selection of weapons, with everything from katana, to kusarigama and from a quarterstaff to a mace. There was even a blowgun and a set of bullets. "Good afternoon, Naruto," Yugo said, distracting the blonde from his daydreaming. "You are probably wondering why I have brought along so many weapons, correct?" Naruto nodded in reply, still struggling to take his eyes off of the array of weapons. "Well, instead of teaching you to fight with a weapon in a particular style, for example the Mugai Ryu school of Batojutsu, I intend to teach you to use a weapon that can be adapted into your taijutsu style, which means it has to be exactly the right kind of weapon for you. It needs to flow with your movements, rather than you having to adjust your movement to use it, as you would if I were to just come out and teach you a katana style, for instance. Do you understand?" "I think so," Naruto stated, still thinking as he spoke. "You want to find something that works for me, naturally. So I don't have to change around everything that I've learned so far." "Right. That's partially correct. I think you will understand what I mean a bit better with some practical explanations." At this, Naruto could have sworn that Yugo's grin changed subtly, into something slightly more sinister. "Pick up a weapon and come at me, Naruto. Try and treat the one that you choose as an extension of yourself, and use your Kage Bunshin in the same way as you would in a taijutsu fight. Yugo slowly drew both of her katana, and slid her leading foot back, ever so slightly, placing herself in a defensive stance. Her blades were both held, seemingly casually, so that they were angled downwards, crossing each other and almost touching the ground. It was one of Yugo's favorite defensive stances. It had hundreds of apparent openings, all of which she had covered with a simple flick of one of her wrists. It enhanced her image of helplessness. It made it even more likely that she would be underestimated. Naruto, grinning wildly at his sensei's invitation, grabbed for the blade that had caught his eye when he first entered the training ground. He was so certain that he was going to love this. Naruto ducked under an infuriatingly casual horizontal slash, aimed at his neck. Yugo-sensei was incredible with her katana. Every time he went to attack, she batted him aside like he was absolutely nothing. He hadn't gotten her to move from the place she started at, in the entire 15 minutes they had been sparring for. Wordlessly, he created a bunshin behind Yugo, which stabbed at her thighs with its katana that has also been cloned. Without even looking, Yugo simply stepped over the attack, and slammed her foot downwards with force upon the flat edge of the blade, snapping it into two. Then, with the same motion, she rotated her hips and drove her other foot into the cheekbone of the bunshin, breaking the bone just before it dispelled. The original Naruto, at the lowest point of his duck, used the momentum of his straightening body to perform an upwards vertical slash, which Yugo sidestepped, with a hint of what could easily be mistaken for arrogance. The blonde summoned another bunshin on Yugo's left side, which performed a diagonal slash across the Jonin. Yugo turned her body slightly to face the clone, and with her blades crossed as they were in her initial stance, both blocked the attack, while at the same time moving inside the bunshin's guard, Naruto's blades sliding forward between Yugo's and being diverted over her shoulder. Using the momentum from her step, she drove her elbow into the bunshin's face, instantly dispelling it. The Jonin instantly went on the attack after destroying the bunshin, not giving the blonde any time to orchestrate his next move. Using the katana in her right, she stepped towards her student and delivered a vicious strike at Naruto's midriff. Once again, the blonde parried the blow, and once again, he was forced into using both of his hands, despite the fact that Yugo had seemed to put very little effort into the attack. However, he was not to be given much time to think about his sensei's technique, as Yugo had already launched her next attack, a fast strike aimed straight at his left kidney. He managed to parry his sensei's attack once more, this time having to use only one hand in order to grant himself the extra flexibility needed to block fast enough. This had its own consequences, however, and his entire arm was jarred by the force of the attack. Yugo took full advantage of this, and aimed a kick at her student's hand, disarming him and sending his katana flying across the training ground, the clatter as it hit the floor echoing around the room. Naruto, we are trying to find a weapon that suits you, remember? You need to move on to the next weapon as soon as you know the one you're using isn't working, okay? Now go pick another. The blonde bit back the protests that had immediately begun to form on the tip of his tongue. After all, he knew his sensei was right. He had been able to feel within the first couple of minutes of sparring that the katana wouldn't work for him. It forced him to alter the rhythm of his movements far too much, and as a result, prevented him from being able to string together his attacks fluidly, as well as disrupting his ability to defend and immediately try to launch a counter to keep his opponent on the back foot. Naruto took a deep breath and looked towards the table upon which Yugo had laid out weapons for him to try, and begun to decide which weapon he would try next. Hokage-sama, we have received an update from Team Kamiko. Sarutobi turned his attention from the dwindling piles of paperwork on his desk, to his secretary, who had just entered the room. Ah, Team Kamiko. They were part of an escort mission to Kumo, were they not? Sarutobi asked, his curiosity piqued. They were Chunin on a relatively simple mission, and had already sent a report detailing that they had been successful, and were returning to Konoha. Yes, Hokage-sama. However, they have come across an injured Sunagaku ninja, on the border to Hai no Kuni. As we are allied to Suna, they have applied emergency field treatment to the ninja. However, they believe that his injuries are too serious for him to be able to make it back to Kase no Kuni without an escort and additional medical treatment. The Suna ninja has stated that Sunagakur is currently unable to provide their own support due to a particularly high mission load. They cannot commit further shinobi without compromising Suna's defenses, and have therefore officially requested a C-rank escort mission for their shinobi. Sarutobi had to pause in order to think. Team Kamiko was comprised of 4 chunin, and as such, were too much of Konoha's manpower to commit to such a relatively minor mission. This in turn, meant that he would need to assign a genin team for this mission. Team 8 had just been assigned their first C rank, so they were definitely out of the question. As for Team 7, both Kakashi and himself had serious doubts as to whether they were ready for a C rank mission, and Kakashi had requested some time to remedy this, before the council inevitably attempted to throw the Uchiha in at the metaphorical deep end. Which of course, left only Naruto and Team 10. However, Asuma had just been sent off on an emergency mission, leaving Team 10 with no sensei. Jiraiya was also due out of the village, in order to investigate a tip-off about the Chikyu no Terazu, joining up with the mysterious organization, Akutsuki. A group shrouded in secrecy that even Jiraiya hadn't been able to find out much about them, which would scream danger to anyone, let alone someone as experienced as Sarutobi. The revelation that his traitorous old student, Orochimaru, had once been amongst their ranks, made Jiraiya's investigation vital to village security. However, for the situation in hand at least, Sarutobi did know of a solution. The elderly Kage reached for a loose bit of paper, and scribbled something down, before handing it to his secretary. "Get me these shinobi, and send a message to Team Kamiko that a relief squad is being sent to take over." He just hoped he wasn't sending the genin he had in mind out too soon. He always felt slightly ill at ease whenever he sent his shinobi out on missions, but it was even worse when he sent out fresh genin. There was always the chance one or more wouldn't come back. A child that would never return to their loved ones. And, despite the strong faith he held in all of his shinobi, he knew risk is always there. However, it was his duty as Hokage, irrespective of his feelings. The genin were the only ones for the job, without compromising the strength of the village, and, on top of that, he had total faith in the jonin that would accompany them. Naruto leapt back from Yugo, avoiding a slash aimed at his torso. He groaned in frustration and threw the tonfa he had been using to the floor, which was now littered with discarded weapons. Panting heavily, he glanced back to the table. The blowgun that had caught his eye before he began remained, along with another staff. He had already used a quarterstaff that had been crafted with a coating of steel, enabling it to be used in combat against bladed weapons, but it had been too slow and cumbersome, not exactly suited to his style of fighting. However, this staff was leaner, although about the same length. Interestingly, it had 2 obvious joints that effectively split the staff into 3, although, as far as Naruto could see, they served little to no purpose. Which piqued his curiosity enough to pick it up. Well, it was that, and the fact that his only other choice was blowgun. As he lifted the weapon from the table, he was shocked at how light it was, yet still felt sturdy, as if it was made out of steel. He instinctively began to twirl it in his hands, and wondered at how agile it felt in comparison to the quarterstaff. He moved to strike the air, to get a feel for the way in which the weapon should be used, and flowed naturally into a series of short, sharp jabs with either end of the staff. Yet another way in which the weapon differed from the conventional. A staff usually looked to perform powerful, but slow blows with the side of his staff, rather than its tips. It is a very unique weapon. Yugo began, clawing Naruto's attention away from his own thoughts. It is made from an fairly rare wood that originates, believe it or not, from Kase no Kuni. The tree that was used to create this weapon is unique, in that its wood can conduct, and channel chakra. And is most commonly used to create chakra paper, which, as you know from your studies, is used to discern one's elemental affinity. However, in the case of this weapon, it means that you can channel chakra through it. As well as this, the person who made this particular weapon enhanced the wood with chakra as he was crafting it, making it incredibly difficult to break or destroy, nullifying any perceived vulnerability it had. Only a few weeks ago, Yugo's words would have gone straight over the genin's head. It was a testament to how far he had come along that he understood everything his sensei had told him. He hadn't stopped at academy knowledge either. At the advice of Hitaki Kakashi, a decidedly odd jonin who had stopped to give Naruto advice, and had even let him use one of his jutsu scrolls to learn a new technique, he had continued reading about the world of shinobi, and continued to learn, too. He had branched out in his reading material too: strategy, basic field usable first aid, genjutsu, use of weapons, and chakra theory of a more advanced level than what was taught in the academy. He had even kept up with geography and history, at Iruka's advice. And he had to admit, he simply didn't understand how on earth he had come to the conclusion that all that boring book stuff would never be useful for a ninja. Of course, there was still even more that he could have been working on. He hadn't gone back to see Iruka to continue working on his chakra control, and focus in his training sessions with Jiraiya had been primarily focused on ninjutsu so far, leaving him with little time to push his taijutsu any further. On top of that, he still hadn't even thought about doing anything practical with genjutsu, either casting or dispelling. He had looked briefly in the library for some basic genjutsu, but most recommended that a chakra control exercise called tree walking should ideally be learnt prior to beginning with them, and Naruto didn't want to risk trying techniques that he had such little knowledge about, before he was absolutely sure he was ready. Naruto abandoned his train of thought, and turned towards his sensei. It was all very well reflecting on his progress and singling out areas for improvement, but he had more immediate things to worry about. "Are you ready to try again, Yugo-sensei?" Naruto asked. Although, you wouldn't think Yugo had even sparred with him at all, just by looking at her. She wasn't breathing even slightly heavily, and looked totally relaxed, whereas Naruto was beginning to look more and more disheveled as the training wore on. Seeing his sensei nod, and adopt the same defensive stance she had begun their training session with, Naruto shifted his grip on his weapon and charged, knowing his sensei would allow him to attack, in order to get a feel for the weapon. "I've just realized. Yugo-sensei didn't even tell me what the weapon was called." He wasn't even sure it mattered, as he got into range of his sensei and immediately leveled a jab aimed straight at her head. Watching his sensei casually sidestep his initial strike, he instantly created a bunshin directed behind her, which attempted to strike her in the back. In response, she shifted her footing and turned the 180 degrees, and decapitated the bunshin with ease. She had intentionally left her back exposed, and Naruto understood the implications immediately. It was both intended to goad him, as she had already taught him that you should never expose your back to an enemy that you feel could ever strike you, and to leave an opening, inviting him to take advantage. A trap, essentially. And the blonde feigned to fall for it, crouching down and attacking the leg that she had the majority of her weight on, in order to upset her balance. Of course, Yugo expected such an attack, and immediately lifted her leg and pivoted in order to strike at the now exposed Naruto. What she didn't expect, however, was for a bunshin to use the crouched blonde's back for leverage in order to launch a vicious diving lunge at her face. Her instincts, honed through years of training and experience, kicked in, and she threw herself backwards, planting her hands on the ground over her swords, and kicked out with both legs, making contact with the clone as it flew over her, dispelling it with an audible crunch. She continued her backwards flipping motion, landing perfectly in a crouched position, both katanas already in her hands. However, no sooner had she returned her attention to the blonde, he was on top of her, himself and his bunshins launching into a series of attacks, each flowing into each other perfectly. The difference in his movement with his current weapon, from when he was using the others, was phenomenal. And for the first time during their session, she was on the back foot. Naturally, she wasn't taking the fight all that seriously. Naruto was still only a genin after all. All the same, the blonde, despite having no training with the weapon whatsoever, was performing exceptionally well. It was clear that this weapon suited him to a T. Now all she needed to do was show him that the object in his hands was not merely a staff, although its clever design meant that it could be used as one. Unfortunately, she thought, sensing the presence that had just entered the training grounds, I will not to be given the time in order to do so. Not just yet, anyway. Naruto too had noticed the extra presence, and stopped his attacks, turning his attention to the new figure in the room. Yugo also turned to meet the man, although she already knew who it was. Uzumaki Naruto is to report to the Hokage within the next 30 minutes for a mission. He is to come prepared for an escort mission lasting at least a week, possibly more, and should be ready to leave immediately after briefing. Naruto glanced to his sensei, who nodded to him, without taking her attention away from the Anbu who had come to deliver the message. You should get going, Naruto. You know what you need to bring from your studies, though I would recommend that you bring extra ninja wire and other trap-making gear, just in case your client is definitely being targeted. Also, I want you to take the weapon with you, it might come in useful, especially since you'll only be going out on a C-rank mission. You might even be going with a Jonin who knows how to use one, and might be able to show you a thing or two, if you've got time. Right, Naruto replied, trying to process the information he had just been given, before moving to leave the room. Oh, and Naruto, it's called a Sansetsuken. Naruto stopped dead, once again trying to process the new information. But a Sansetsuken is a 3. Get moving. Figure it out later. Yugo interjected, causing Naruto to stir into action once more. Nodding in the affirmative, Naruto set off, actually managing to leave the training ground this time. I take it the Hokage wants me present for the briefing. Should I be in Anbu attire, or not? It's entirely up to you, Azuki-san. Although, Hokage-sama would like you to stay out of sight throughout, unless you need to interject. Thank you, Anbu-san. Yugo replied. The masked figure didn't bother to indicate he had heard her, before disappearing in a puff of smoke. That guy is always so rude when he puts on that mask. No sense of humor, either. Yugo muttered to herself, before leaving the training ground herself and heading towards the Hokage Tower. She had to make it there early, after all. So all of you understand the mission objectives. Yes, Hokage-sama. We are to rendezvous with Team Kamiko, give them their new orders, and then, administer further first aid to the injured Sunanin and escort him back to Sunagakure once he can be transported safely. We leave immediately, replied a certain Hatake Kakashi, his usual lazy drawl replaced with a serious tone, reserved only for receiving orders. Sarutobi gazed at the shinobi he had selected for the mission. Uzumaki Naruto was a given, especially after his rapid progression since his graduation. Sarutobi could see the excitement burning behind his eyes, despite his attempts to remain serious and calm during the briefing. Him even attempting to remain serious told Sarutobi all he needed to know about how far the boy had come. Alongside him stood Nara Shikamaru, the only person Asuma had deemed ready to undertake a C-rank mission. Once again, this genin's exterior appearance disguised the mind within. He appeared almost bored, and reluctant to be here. Yet, after years of working with his father, and even his grandfather before that, the Hokage could practically see the gears turning in his head. Possible formations, routes, likely opposition, his team's capabilities, you name it, the child was working it through in his head, planning everything he could and covering almost every conceivable eventuality. Thirdly, there was Inuzuka Hana, a 15-year-old genin who had been training to be a medic nin, alongside her clan's training as a vet. She excelled at both, and was one of the most capable healers at the Konoha hospital, despite her relatively tender age. She had been deemed as all that was necessary in order to treat the Suna nin's injuries to the extent where he would be able to move. She could also hold her own in combat, if needs be, although she was far more capable alongside the three of her ninkin. They were being left behind, still recovering from injuries from a previous mission. Good. Sarutobi started. If there are any problems, report to me as soon as possible. I take it Konoha will be keeping a close watch on this mission. Kakashi spoke cryptically, earning curious looks from all three genin present. They weren't aware of the other presence, hidden in the shadows of the room, where the Anbu usually concealed themselves. Naturally. Although, we'll stay out of your way. You're in complete command, Kakashi. Sarutobi took a quick breath before continuing. I advise you begin now. Try to get as much distance between Konoha and yourselves as you can before nightfall. You are dismissed. Understood, Hokage-sama. Kakashi nodded towards the Hokage before turning towards his three new team members, with his eye curved into something that could only be assumed was a smile. Well then, let's get moving. Those bastard Konoha ninjas. They will have definitely called for backup by now. Spoke a figure hidden by the shadows, looking down into canyon below, where Asuna ninja was propped up next to a rock, conversing with a group of 4 Konoha ninjas around him. Relax. They will have sent for medical relief and an escort by now, then they will return to their village. The escort will be comprised mostly of genin, and therefore vulnerable. Konoha can't afford to commit more than that to escort a foreign ninja. Another voice spoke in response, so we'll wait for the relief, and these shinobi to leave. And then we'll kill them. The first voice interrupted, the excitement evident in his voice. Of course. We'll kill every last one of them, and then take what we came for. Kakashi glanced back over his shoulder at his makeshift team of almost totally green genin. To be totally honest, he was relieved that his first ever mission leading a genin team was not with his own genin. His just never took to the ethos he wanted in a squad that was led by him. Sai kept himself to himself, and to anyone who knew what to look for, it was blindingly obvious he had been trained by Danzo. It wasn't that he could control his emotions particularly well, it was more so that he had no emotions to speak of. He had been conditioned to an inhumane level, and Kakashi doubted his ability, or that of the rest of his team, to break him down. Not only that, Sai was streets ahead of any genin Kakashi had ever seen. As far as his team's ability to complete missions went, that in itself wasn't a problem. It was how his team reacted to Sai's ability that was. Uchiha Sasuke was his biggest concern. Openly driven by revenge, the boy had major insecurities about his own ability, well covered by his supposed superiority over his classmates. However, Sai had utterly destroyed that false perception, and Sasuke had been enraged by it. He had closed himself off from the rest of his team, and devoted himself to gaining strength, even more so than before. Kakashi couldn't get through to him, Sai didn't have a reason to, and Sakura couldn't see that anything was wrong. Sakura herself, in comparison to her other teammates, was a minor inconvenience. She had some serious talent, but no motivation to use it. She spent too much time worrying about diets, clothes, and impressing Sasuke to devote any energy to improving herself as a shinobi. Kakashi knew she would eventually learn. Either through her own thoughts and reflections, or the hard way, through losing a teammate, or suffering a serious injury, even though Kakashi would do his utmost to prevent the last two options. Trying to lead his first mission as a sensei with his own team would be incredibly difficult. However, as it stood, the 3 genin he was now leading seemed to be getting on incredibly well. Naruto was currently listening to the Inuzuka girl, Hana, tell animated tales of her experiences on missions with her own team. Whilst Shikamaru was walking slightly ahead of them, trying to look bored and hide his interest in the conversation, or more specifically, Naruto. The Nara occasionally interjected, attempting to fish for information about the blonde, who was being more open than Kakashi supposed Shikamaru had ever seen him, or at least more true to himself. Shikamaru's questioning of Naruto indicated to the Jonin that some of the blonde's age group had noticed something wasn't quite right for Naruto, and that maybe, as a result, had tried to make Naruto's life a little bit better. True or not, it made Kakashi feel at least a little bit less guilty. Of course, he would do his best to make it up to Naruto himself, the only ways he thought he could. Firstly, by telling him as much as he could about his father, as soon as he got the chance. Secondly, by teaching Naruto shinobi arts whenever the opportunity arose. He had already started with the latter, if only a little, and from what he had heard, Naruto had taken what he had said on board, and dived into some extracurricular reading. On top of that, he had managed to learn the jutsu that Kakashi had given to him, and already managed to adapt it in such a way that only he could. I mean, an underground Bunshin ambush. Itachi would have been proud of that one. The thought of Itachi had given Kakashi another idea for a jutsu he could teach the blonde. Unfortunately, that one might have to wait a bit. It was a jutsu that suited Naruto down to a T, but that was the big risk. This particular jutsu was explosive, to say the least. For now, Kakashi thought, eyeing the weapon hastily fastened to the blonde's back, he should probably focus on things that were perhaps a little bit more basic. Say, Naruto, Kakashi said, interrupting the conversation between the genin. How much do you know about the weapon you have on your back? I know it can't have been that long ago that you first started using it, because there's nothing about it on your file. Naruto his head to the side in thought before answering. Well, I only just started using it while I was training with Yugo-sensei before I got sent out on this mission, so I really don't have any experience with it at all. I only bought it in case I got a bit of free time to experiment with it. I wouldn't risk trying to use it in an actual fight just yet, although I like to think I was pretty good just using it as a staff. And what do you mean by just using it as a staff, Naruto? The masked Jonin inquired, his eye curved once again, creating what can only really be described as an eye smile. Well, I know it's called a Sansetsuken, and I've seen them before. They are like a staff cut into 3 sections, joined by chains. But this, Naruto trailed off, indicating to his weapon in order to make his point, which he now held in his hands. And what do you know about the wood it was made out of? Kakashi asked, eye smile still firmly in place. It was made from a tree that can only be found in Kei's no Kuni, and things made from its wood are able to channel chalk. Naruto stopped dead as the realization hit him, once again seemingly unable to finish his own sentence, and Kakashi had to stop himself from snorting with laughter at the over-the-top groan of frustration that escaped from the blonde. It's so obvious, the blonde exclaimed, irritated at his own failure to work out how to use the Sansetsuken himself. And while Kakashi partially agreed with him, it wasn't all the blonde's fault. He had spent the vast majority of his life both stunted in his education, and intentionally trying to act the fool as part of the facade he had put up, in order to avoid thinking about how lonely he was. And as a result, the way of thinking developed in those conditions was incredibly hard to displace. Naruto's desire to improve, as well as the use of the Kage Bunshin, was helping him overcome his deficiencies. However, as Naruto was now finding out, old habits die hard. Whilst he was immeasurably better than he was before, his mind still occasionally slipped up as a result of how rapid his turnaround had been. He would still struggle with some things others might call easy, and he might not notice things others would think obvious still, but these occasions were rare, and getting rarer still all the time. Don't worry about it. Why don't you try channeling your chakra through it, and we'll see if I can't teach you a few things about the mechanics of the weapon. Naruto, in response, turned his attention to the Sansetsuken. Gripping the weapon with his right hand, he concentrated on his own chakra, molding it within him and gradually channeling it through the weapon. As he did this, the 2 joints on the weapon seemed to take a blue, almost unnoticeable hue. Naruto, who had been trying hard to use as little chakra as he possibly could, allowed the chakra flow into the weapon increase, and as he did, the blue glow around the became more pronounced. Before the weapon finally separated into 3 distinct sections, the 2 Naruto was not gripping, dropping downwards. The blonde looked at the weapon, now entirely different, with a look of amazement. The three sections were being held together by two chakra threads, thick enough to be clearly seen between each. What's more, Naruto could feel an external force molding his chakra from within the weapon, meaning he did not have to continually focus on maintaining the threads themselves. It was automatic. Sansetsuken crafted for shinobi are incredibly unique, as they use chakra to manipulate the weapon in a way that one simply couldn't do with a plain variation of the weapon. The smith who makes them weaves several seals into them, and although I don't know nearly enough about fuinjutsu to be able to explain how they work, I know they essentially allow for two things. Firstly, one set of seals create and maintain the chakra threads for you for as long as you are channeling your chakra through the weapon, meaning you are able to fight without having to focus on keeping the threads functional. Secondly, another set of seals allow you to manipulate the weapon by simply changing the way you channel your chakra through it. I'll give you a quick demonstration. Kakashi reached for the scrolls he had attached to his flak jacket, and removed one seemingly without looking. Unfurling in with one hand, he focused some chakra to the index finger of the other, and applied it to the seal that was visible on the otherwise blank scroll. A sound, not dissimilar to that of a cage bunshin being created, was heard at the moment of impact, and smoke created by chakra being dispelled masked the scroll and its immediate surroundings. When it cleared, Kakashi was holding his very own Sansetsuken to match Naruto's. He began channeling his own chakra through the weapon, causing it to separate, and assume the same position at the blondes. Now I want you to watch carefully, and try to guess how I'm manipulating my chakra, in order to achieve what I am. This is the first step towards learning the shinobi Sansetsuken, and you should practice this alongside the forms and stances you will learn, and only combine the two once you are proficient at both. Kakashi raised the weapon, extending his hand so it was directly out in front of him, and began focusing on his chakra. Slowly, the three genin watching saw the two sections of the Sansetsuken that Kakashi wasn't holding begin to rise, until the weapon was perfectly straight, as it was before Kakashi had begun to channel his chakra. Next, the very top section began to spin slowly, seemingly of its own volition, on its chakra thread. After a few rotations, it straightened again, and the middle and the top section began to spin together in the same way, both staying straight while they rotated. The slow manner in which they spun indicated that the Jonin was in complete control of their movements. Kakashi stopped the section spinning, and continued to manipulate the weapon's sections in different ways, demonstrating that each section could be controlled and moved independently through manipulating the chakra threads in the joints. Obviously, in most situations, you would maintain a two-handed grip on the weapon. However, the ability to maneuver the weapon using your chakra adds an extra dimension to your attacks, and of course, if you're clever, gives you the opportunity to use your free hand for other things if needs be. The reason I was performing these movements so slowly was both to give you the chance to try and work out how I was using my chakra in order to create the movements, and also because this is the speed you should begin your practice at. You will find that you should be able to move the weapon at faster speeds once you nail the concept down, but your movements will lack control and precision, and in all honesty, you will struggle to perform at very high speeds in a combat situation. Instead, you should practice everything as slowly as possible, and look to gradually build up the speed. If you are not in total control, you are practicing too fast. You should be able to start practicing whilst we move. We still have a mission to get on with after all. Sue, is this kind of like shape transformation? I don't really know much about it, as it's only mentioned briefly in everything I've read so far. Naruto asked, his eyes still firmly focused on the weapon he held in his hand. Kakashi nodded in response. Shape transformation isn't as advanced as it sounds. It's simply molding chakra into shapes, and specific movements, outside of your body. It does, however, take a lot of practice to get it right. As far as using it with the Sansetsuken, it is much easier to manage, as the weapon acts as a physical construct for you to manipulate, rather than just trying to manipulate pure chakra outside of your body. Learning to use the Sansetsuken is actually a good base for moving on to pure shape transformation. Rather than try to move the sections of the weapon with your chakra, picture the weapon as being made out of chakra, and mold the weapon as you would your own chakra. Right. I think I get it. Thanks, Kakashi-sensei, Naruto said, as he turned his attention to his Sansetsuken, seemingly adding the honorific without realizing it. Kakashi would never tell anyone, but secretly, that single moment had made him feel happier than he could remember being in a long time. 2 days passed as the group traveled towards the border of High no Kuni, and Naruto was already beginning to grasp the basics of manipulating his Sansetsuken. It took him nearly the entire first day to be able to move the weapon at all with his chakra, but once he had worked precisely how he needed to mold his chakra in order to generate the movement, he figured out the other things incredibly quickly. First, learn to force the weapon to go rigid, as it was before he channeled his chakra through it, only extended by the chakra threads. Next, he had learned how to move each section individually, by manipulating the individual chakra threads. He did everything as slowly as possible, and he soon realized Kakashi had been right about control of the weapon. If he tried to move a section faster than he was comfortable with, he would lose control over the amount the section would move, where it stopped, and he would even occasionally cause the other to move too. Now, about an hour since the group had crossed into the barren, rocky area on the border between High no Kuni and Kase no Kuni that later led to the deserts of Kase no Kuni, he was rotating the final section of his weapon on its chakra thread, incredibly slowly, focusing intently on its rotation, so intently in fact, he nearly missed Kakashi speak. We're here. This is the canyon that Team Kamiko and the injured Suna shinobi are taking cover. Naruto looked up to take a better look at his surroundings. The stone beneath his feet still hadn't yet given way to the sand, and the area still hadn't given way to the flat, barren expanses of the desert. The terrain was still stone dry, however the landscape around them was craggy and uneven, with various stone outcrops, and rock formations littering their surroundings. Some, in the distance, looked to equal the size of small mountains, seemingly towering above the shinobi, despite their distance away. Directly in front of him, was the most interesting feature of the entire area. In front of them, stood an enormous stone archway, easily 10 foot across, beyond which, the stone ground sunk below and expanded outwards, creating some kind of bizarre canyon, that went on for further than Naruto could see. Rock formations were built up along the tops of the walls of the canyons too, meaning that once inside it would be almost impossible to see anything along the edge once you were inside. Kakashi, was this canyon man-made? It had been Shikamaru that voiced the question, although it had begun to form in the minds of the other two genin. Almost definitely. However, no one knows how it was done. This canyon, and the people who once lived inside, as far as we can tell, predated ninjutsu by quite a bit. People lived in there? Naruto asked, slightly incredulously. The canyon actually goes a lot further than we need to go, and we won't be progressing all the way through it to get to Suna either. Which I'm glad for, if I'm honest. The canyon is about 15 feet across once you move down beyond the archway, and then expands again a while later, by quite a lot into some kind of room, if you will. It is a circular space, around the same area as a public training ground. This is where Team Kamiko are holding out. However, if you go beyond that, the area narrows again, for about half an hour at walking speed, before beginning to head even deeper underground, and finally, opening out once again. And there is what's left of a small village built into the rock. As Kakashi finished his sentence, the genin simultaneously drew a breath. An underground village, that predated ninjutsu, seemed both a ridiculous and impossible notion. Yet here they were, being confronted with one. Wait, Naruto said, looking slightly thoughtful. Was this like a hidden village? Were the people that lived here, like shinobi? That's certainly the most popular theory. As you know, even without ninjutsu, there is a lot included in the shinobi arts, and there is every chance that these people were as deadly as a modern shinobi. Which makes what happened even more unnerving. What do you mean, what happened? This time it was Hana that spoke, audibly concerned at the fact a Jonin could be unnerved by something that happened to people so long ago. Again, we don't know for sure. But what has been found out was that the entire village was wiped out. Every man, woman, and child killed and left to rot in that canyon. They knew something was coming for them, too. Doors had been locked and barricaded, there were hastily made fortifications everywhere, too. They knew they were in grave danger, and yet, didn't try and leave. Hundreds of sets of remains have been found, all of the people who used to live here. Women found huddled over their children, the men before them desperately trying to protect their families. Warriors on the outside, all ready to give their lives for their homes, and those that they loved. Every single one, dead. And we still have no idea what did it. I've had to go down there before, on a mission. And all I know, is that I'll never forget it, and I sure as hell don't want to go back there. But, like I said, we won't be going that far down into the canyon. All three genin shared a look. Before, one or two of them might have had ideas of exploring the abandoned village. Somehow, the idea that any of them still harbored those plans seemed incredibly unlikely. A figure, hidden amongst one of the rock formations that overlooked the inside of the canyon, swore violently, anger tainting his voice, the need for quiet transforming his rant into a low hiss. Hatake Kakashi. Hatake ing Kakashi. What the air we gonna do now? Well, wait for the next ing team. What a brilliant idea. Now we're screwed. How are we gonna get it now? The man paused in his rant, breathing heavily as he finished venting his rage. Will you relax? A second man spoke, from his position atop the formation, sitting casually and seemingly looking over the entire landscape. We have our trump card still, and in case you didn't notice, that bastard Hatake was with a couple of genin. He can't fight the both of us, and defend them at the same time. We'll kill the runts, get what we came for, and then exact some much-deserved revenge on that arrogant, masked bastard. I still think you're underestimating him. He killed so many of us. He's dangerous, man. You have the seals, right? The second man barked out, eliciting a sharp grunt in affirmation from the fist. Well, wait until Hatake moves past and the other Konoha ninja leave, and lay down every last one. They're trapped, and then, they'll be outnumbered. Like I said, Hatake can't protect the brats and fight us. Fine. Let's do this. On one condition though, the first figure stating, drawing the direct gaze of his partner. I get to rip that bastard's eyes out myself. They had only been moving for a few minutes and Naruto was already starting to feel nervous. Except, it wasn't the thought of the ghost village they were getting ever closer to that was worrying him, it was where he was now. The path, as Kakashi promised, had gotten wider as they went deeper. However, about minute down Naruto had spotted something in the wall up ahead, on the left-hand side. It was a stone statue, carved out of the wall. It stood 6 feet tall, and held a sword in front of its own chest, the flat of the blade nearly resting against the body of the figure. However, the outstanding feature of the statue was not its weapon, but its face. Or rather, lack of face. No eyes, no mouth, and no nose. Just smoothly carved stone, where the facial features should have been. And then, Shikamaru saw the others. The entire path ahead was lined on both sides by the faceless stone warriors, all guarding the path towards the village hidden ahead of them. They had no eyes, yet for the entire time they walked down that path, the blonde could have sworn that he was being watched. However, as uncomfortable as it may have been for the genin, the walk to their destination was a fairly short one, and soon, the large opening into the next section of the canyon was visible, and the team of Konoha shinobi they had been sent to meet was visible ahead of them. Kakashi, you finally made it. Thank God for that. I'd kill for a shower about now. The first of the Konoha ninja exclaimed as Kakashi and his squad approached their position. She was definitely an experienced shinobi. She held her flak jacket, indicating her rank was above genin, in her right hand, seemingly believing it was too hot to wear it. She was dressed incredibly plainly, wearing the standard shinobi attire of Konoha, and her headband being used to keep her shoulder-length blonde hair out of her face. It was her poise, like many of the best shinobi, that set her apart from her Chunin comrades. Every movement she made, perfectly controlled, despite her near-exhausted state. Kamiko, you look terrible. How long have you been out of the village? We'd been escorting a pair of rich businessmen from Suna as they traveled to make a high-profile business deal in Kumo. They did what they had to do, no issues, but on the way back we were attacked by a couple of shinobi. Some hotshot missing nin who had just become a jonin, with a bunch of his little friends, decided they needed the money these two have. They were pretty good, too. Gave us a good fight. Once we had dealt with them, and got moving back towards Suna again, we came across our new friend over there. Kamiko indicated to the Suna shinobi, resting up against a rock, a short while away from the group. He was unconscious when we found him, and he's banged up pretty bad. Nothing fatal as far as I can see, but he can't walk, has chakra exhaustion, and I'm pretty sure he has a broken arm, but I ain't a medic, so you'd be better off taking a look at him yourselves. Kakashi looked thoughtful before turning to Hana. Hana, why don't you go and see if you can diagnose him, and see how quickly you can get him on his feet without compromising his recovery? The Inuzuka nodded before heading over to the injured shinobi and getting to work. He turned back to Kamiko. What can you tell me about him? Kakashi asked, referring to the injured shinobi. Well, he's spent a lot of time asleep since he regained consciousness, and we've been here for 3 days now, so we haven't gotten that much from him. We know he was on some kind of retrieval mission, to get hold of some kind of ancient weapon that belonged to Sunagakur and had been lost in battle, because the first thing he did when he became conscious again was check that he still had the weapon in his bag, which he does. We also got out of him that he wasn't alone. His 2 teammates were Chunin, and both were killed in the early moments of the fight. She trailed off, glancing towards Naruto and Shikamaru. Listen, Kakashi, we can stay if you want. When we asked for assistance, we still didn't know that there was a chance we'd be up against enemy shinobi. I didn't think Hokage-sama would send Genin to here of all places. Ideally, Kakashi would have liked to take her up on the offer. He really didn't want to be leading Genin into such a dangerous situation. But a glance at Kamiko and her team dispelled those thoughts quickly. She was moving gingerly, and he could tell she hadn't managed to rest enough to replenish her chakra. The rest of her team was just as ragged. They had been out for weeks now, with little to no rest. We both know what would happen if you were attacked at the moment, Kamiko. I appreciate the offer, but we'll manage. Besides, we have a little help to call upon if things get a little desperate. Get home, Kamiko. Rest, you've earned it, I'd say. Bah, Kakashi, you noble bastard. We'll head out straight away then, if you don't mind. I'd like to get into High no Kuni as soon as possible. I've had enough of trying to sleep on stone. See you back in Konoha. And with that, the 4 Konoha shinobi left the way Kakashi and his team had came in. The silver-haired Jonin turned to the remainder of his team. Well, what do you two say we go and see how Hana is getting on, and then we'll decide what our next move is? The 2 genin nodded, and followed Kakashi towards the injured Suna shinobi. Suddenly, Kakashi paused mid-stride. What is it, Kakashi-sensei? Naruto asked, looking curiously at the Jonin. That Suna ninja is one of their most respected Jonin. He's listed in the bingo book as being incredibly dangerous. I only just recognized him. Kakashi paused as he took another look at the shinobi, just to be sure. His name is Baki. Well, he's a lot better off than I thought he would be. Hana began, speaking to Kakashi, even as she performed her diagnosis jutsu. He's just resting at the moment, and as far as I can see, there's no lingering damage to his head, but it would be wise if he was given a more thorough look over in Suna. He is suffering from minor chakra exhaustion, but I'll be able to help him with that fairly easily, at least enough to get him on the move again. As far as our actual mission goes, our most pressing concern is his broken bones. Hana stopped her jutsu, the green chakra that had been surrounding her hands as she worked fading away, and turned her attention to Kakashi. His arm is broken quite severely, and it will take some time to heal enough to move him, even with my medical ninjutsu. His leg is not so bad, and given there are no complications, I can have him up and moving, with help, within a few hours. However, as a medic, I'd have to recommend that we keep him still, at least for another few hours, so I can try and cut down on the risk of further damage when we do try to move him. Ideally, I'd need 3 or 4 hours. But if we absolutely need to, we can be going in 2, possibly less if someone helps him move. Kakashi pondered over what the team's appointed medic had said. In theory, they should stay for as long as needed, in order to make sure Baki got patched up properly before they got moving. But Kakashi had a bad feeling about this mission. The Suna Jonin had gotten a pretty banged up by whoever it was that attacked him, and had managed to take out the Jonin's 2 teammates, which meant that they were pretty good. Then there was the matter of Baki's cargo, which was most likely the enemy's target, but if that was the case, why did they retreat? Kakashi doubted that Baki had managed to kill all 3 of them, especially given how much he had been injured, and even if he had, Baki couldn't have moved that far before Kamiko and her squad had found him, meaning there should have been bodies. All of which led Kakashi to the conclusion that the enemy shinobi would be back. And now it was just him and 3 genin that stood between them and their prize. Hana was far more experienced than her rank let on, as she had forsaken the Chunin exams several times in order to train as a combat medic, and as a result she had also realized Kakashi's concerns even whilst performing the diagnosis jutsu, which is likely the only reason she brought up how quickly she could get Baki on his feet. We have a few hours, get him ready to move. With any luck we can be out of here and well on our way to Suna before trouble arrives. Right, I'll get to work on his leg straight away. Unless you want to speak with him, I won't bother to wake him up. I can work faster whilst he's asleep. Kakashi could see how reluctant the medic in her was to try to get Baki moving so soon, yet at the same time, the shinobi part of her understanding the need to get moving. Let him rest for a while, although I will need to speak with him, soon, to see what information he can give us about what we're up against. Understood. I'll work as fast as I can, and let you know if he wakes up. Hana hovered her hands over Baki's leg, green chakra already oozing from her hands, even as she spoke to the Jonin. Kakashi turned to Naruto and Shikamaru, who had been listening intently to the conversation, and were now aware, to some extent, of the gravity of their situation. I need you two alert, and ready for anything. Naruto, summon a pair of Kage Bunshin, have them patrol the area that we came from. Shikamaru, and the original Naruto, whilst I want you to stay alert, prepare for an ambush. Figure out possible lines of attack, traps, work out counters, do as much as you can. I'll keep watch, and maybe try and input some ideas if you need them. He watched as the pair got to work. 2 Bunshin appeared next to the blonde, without him having even moved, and immediately got to work, whilst Shikamaru sat down cross-legged, an intense look of concentration on his face, his eyes occasionally darting around, observing their surroundings. It was impressive, to say the least. Many fresh genin would have crumbled from the pressure in a similar situation, but these 2, as well as Hana, didn't even appear fazed. This could of course meant complacency on the part of the rookie ninja, however Kakashi somewhat doubted that. Hana already had a year's worth of experience out in the field, and that was only so low because missions had taken a back seat to her medical training. Shikamaru seemed to be as cool and composed under pressure as his father was, and Kakashi knew the Nara wouldn't underestimate the gravity of the situation. Naruto would have concerned him if they were in this position a few months ago, but even a cursory glance at the blonde assuaged most of Kakashi's worry. It was clear how much the genin had grown since the night he found out about his father, and his time with Yugo and Jiraiya had pushed him farther forward than anyone, possibly even the Sandaime himself, could have anticipated. Despite that, however, Kakashi doubted that the genin that made up his squad would be a match for the enemy that had been strong enough to severely wound Baki, and capture or kill the rest of his squad. His lone eye turned its gaze to the sheer rock walls that surrounded the Konoha ninja and carefully watched the top of the canyon for any signs of movement. Somewhere up there, he supposed, lurked an enemy that, if they were unlucky enough, he would have to fight in order to give the genin he had with him any hope of escaping. He didn't doubt the young shinobi that accompanied him were talented, but anybody capable of bringing down someone of Baki's caliber would be, quite simply, out of their league. Two identical figures cautiously made their way through the canyon back towards where they had entered it in the first place, fully alert, searching for any trace of an enemy. Although they were aware that, as Kage Bunshin, it wasn't a particularly large issue if they were killed. It was vital that if they were to be defeated, they obtained at least a snippet of information about the enemy for the original to use. However, this was getting ever harder as the minutes went by. Night was falling, and with it, the scant light the sun provided the inside of the canyon was disappearing, making it almost impossible to see more than a few meters in any direction. One of the Bunshin paused momentarily, and strained its senses. He could have sworn he heard a noise from the dense walls of the canyon, almost like a faint scratching, similar to the sound a snake made as it moved across solid ground. That was when he spotted it. Almost as if the canyon's side was a liquid, the surface of the rock began to displace before the Bunshin's eyes. Mesmerized by the sight before him, the Bunshin lost focus, and was instantly dispelled as an arm wielding a kunai shot from the rock itself, slashing the blade across the Naruto replica's face. The second Bunshin immediately took a step back from the wall that the threat had emerged from and watched fascinated as the hand withdrew back into the canyon wall. The remaining Bunshin's instincts screamed at him to move as he felt the air around begin to heat, and he nearly dived to the side too late, only managing to dodge the fire jutsu that had been launched at him by a fraction. The Bunshin got shakily to his feet, only to feel a hand clasp roughly across his mouth and a sharp pain to explode in his chest. And I was so looking forward to watching you burn. Even if you are just a Kage Bunshin. With that, the assailant released his grip on the Bunshin and removed his blade from its chest, leaving it to begin to fall, before dispelling in a puff of smoke. The figure glanced angrily towards the canyon wall. What the was that? There you were lecturing me not to give away any techniques, and you go ahead and use your best one. What about your chakra? We're fighting Hatake Kakashi. Tonight. Slowly another figure emerged from the canyon wall, stepping away from the solid rock as though it were some kind of portal to another dimension. Calm down. I didn't show it for long enough for any of them to be able to work out exactly what it was. Besides, did you get a look at his face? We have another of our targets. Activate the seals. We move now. The first man just grinned widely, and followed the other's instruction, any disagreement forgotten. Tonight, Hatake Kakashi and the son of the Yondaime Hokage would die by his hand. Naruto inhaled sharply, as the memories of his Bunshin rushed into his head, one after the other. My Kage Bunshin have been killed. The blonde exclaimed, drawing the attention of his entire team. Tell me exactly what happened, Naruto. Kakashi ordered, his demeanor almost instantly changing to that of a Jonin commander. Well, I can really explain what happened to the first one. And hand came out of the canyon wall and attacked, except it wasn't really like the Doden, Shinji Zanshu. It was almost as if the rock was made from water, and the hand just kind of emerged from it, without damaging the wall at all. Kakashi couldn't help but be intrigued as to the ability Naruto described. He had heard of a technique like it, but little was known of its exact details outside of its village of origin, Iwagakure. He had checked out the list of recent missing nin from Iwa prior to leaving for this mission too, in order to try and prepare for possible attempts on Naruto's life while they were gone. I think the second Bunshin was destroyed by someone else, although it was pretty hard to tell. Naruto continued, focusing on the memories he had inherited. It managed to dodge some kind of Kaden jutsu, but the enemy managed to kill it from behind, with some kind of blade, I think. That's good, Naruto. Any information on the enemy we can get improves our chances massively, although ideally we would want a bit more, so we could try and identify the enemy. Unfortunately, the fact that they attacked your Bunshin indicates they intend strike sooner rather than later. Kakashi sighed before turning towards Hana, who was still working on Baki's injuries. Hana, I'm going to need Baki good to go as soon as possible. How long do you need to get him ready to move? Hana paused in her work, frustration that she would have to move her patient sooner than was good for his health evident on her face. I need an hour at best. I need to ensure his bones aren't going to break again when we move him, otherwise he could be facing permanent damage. That will have to do, then. I don't think we're going to be able to stay any longer than that. Unfortunately, you are going to have to move him away from the wall. Given the enemy's ability, I don't think it would be safe to keep him up against it. Naruto, Shikamaru help her, and then get into a defensive formation around Hana. I need you to stay absolutely focused, okay? Hi, Kakashi-sensei. Came the call from all three of the genin as they got to work, the two male shinobi listening intently to Hana's instruction on how to move Baki with as little risk as possible, and then proceeding to carefully move the ninja away from the stone wall he had been resting against, and laid him down a few meters away from the wall, resting his head upon the dull green flak jacket that Hana had removed previously in order to diagnose the Suna shinobi. Naruto created a cage bunshin, allowing himself and Shikamaru to form a basic triangular formation around the genin medic and her patient, and began to focus on his senses, listening for the slight scratching sounds his bunshin had heard before it had been destroyed, when he had a thought. Kakashi-sensei, I don't suppose you've heard of any techniques that let you move through rock like the one my bunshin saw, do you? Naruto inquired, being careful not to lose focus on his surroundings as he spoke to the Jonin. I do know of one clan from Iwagakure that had a similar technique as their Kekai Genkei, but the last of that clan were wiped out during the last shinobi war. The experienced shinobi's senses flared as he felt a surge of chakra ahead of him in the clearing that his team had occupied. His was moving almost before he had time to process what he had felt as the telltale chakra surge of a Shunshin no Jutsu, a technique that allowed shinobi to move at almost untraceable speeds over short distances. His kunai was all ready to hand as a single figure materialized before him, ready to land a fatal strike before his enemy could recover from the momentary daze that usually accompanied such techniques. But why would he just Shunshin straight into the clearing? It's common knowledge that Shunshin's movements can, to an extent, be traced easily. Kakashi's lone eye widened mid-charge as he realized his error, and without stopping his charge, he formed the signs for the Kawarimi no Jutsu. At almost that exact moment, single-hand armed with a kunai shot from the ground below the Konoha ninja, looking to cause serious damage to Kakashi's legs. Anticipating the attack, the Cycloptic Jonin activated his jutsu, the attack inches away from striking him, and the enemy shinobi found himself striking at a large rock that had initially been next to the trio of genin. Hitaki Kakashi. The enemy shinobi who had launched the attack from underground began, his face struggling to conceal his apparent anger at the jonin. I expected a little more than a basic jutsu like Kawarimi from the man who has copied over 1,000 jutsu. What's the point in wasting chakra, if all I need to beat the likes of you is the basics anyway? Kakashi retorted, appearing far more nonchalant than he actually felt, attempting to see if he could get a rise out of his opponents. I've had enough of sitting here and looking at you, Hitaki. I'm gonna tear out that bastard eye and ram it down your damn throat. The ninja who had used Shunshin to move into the clearing, took a step forward ready to charge at the Konoha nin. Hitoshi, take another step and you're a dead man. The other shinobi hissed the warning to his comrade, his eyes never leaving Kakashi as he spoke. The man identified as Hitoshi narrowed his eyes dangerously, and ground his teeth in anger, but held his position all the same. Listen, once that jutsu is ready, we can finish Hitaki for good. But it can only happen once the jutsu is ready, and even then, we have to work together, otherwise we'll end up like the others. We've waited too long for this to screw it up now. The mont's words seemed to calm Hitoshi down, if only a little. However, the respite had allowed Kakashi time to analyze the pair in front of him a little closer, and attempt to identify the enemy before him. Suddenly, the name brought a memory to the forefront of Kakashi's mind, a memory that the veteran of the Third Shinobi War would rather forget. Isao Hitoshi and Masanori Eiji, former genin of Iwagakure. Kakashi paused, unsure of how to proceed, this being a topic he had fully intended to never have to breach, if he could at all help it. Unfortunately, he doubted he had much say in the matter at this point in time, and was pretty sure that he wanted to be the first one to answer the question the genin team he commanded would inevitably have. And survivors of the Raiden massacre. The Jonin looked directly into the eyes of his enemies, and saw the venomous glares of two people out for revenge, no matter the cost. Another 2 lives warped and destroyed by war, another 2 lives warped and destroyed by his own 2 hands. I've never heard of the Raiden massacre before. How the hell does it involve you, Kakashi-sensei? Predictably, it was Naruto that spoke up first, Hana still trying to get Baki ready to move in case Kakashi couldn't put the 2 Iwa shinobi down alone, and Shikamaru most likely having heard enough to work out the link between the event Kakashi spoke of, and the Jonin himself. You wouldn't have heard about, because your bastard of a Yondaime Hokage filed it away as a blacklisted mission before the end of the Third Shinobi War, and made it an A-rank village secret. I'm willing to bet there are only 2 or 3 people left Konoha who even know the event even happened. It was Hitoshi that answered the question, his words carrying an acidic edge to them, one that made Kakashi mentally grimace. That's probable one of the worst things in my opinion. This time it was Eiji who spoke, his words lacking the unbridled rage that his partners did, instead, carrying a bitter sting to them, reminding Kakashi somewhat of himself after the end of the war. The fact that the day when 27 Iwagakure genin, none of them older than 13 years of age, were slaughtered by a Konoha Jonin, when they posed no legitimate threat to Konoha, so close to the end of the war, a day that is still annually mourned in Iwa, is a criminal offense to even mention in Konoha, also your village can maintain its reputation. The 3 genin, Naruto in particular, looked shell-shocked by the claims of the former Iwa shinobi. Of course none of them had experienced shinobi warfare, nor had they felt the tempestuous fury caused by the loss of comrades, friends, and even lovers. Of course, none of them would fully understand. God willing, none of them would ever have to, although given that the existence of shinobi revolved around the art of killing, Kakashi somewhat doubted that as a possibility. And the Konoha ninja that committed the massacre? None other than the famous Hatake Kakashi. Eiji enunciated Kakashi's name with the same viciousness that Hitoshi had been speaking with moments earlier, unable to prevent the vitriol from creeping into his voice, momentarily losing the emotional control that most ninjas strive to keep. Kakashi found himself wincing once more at the tone of the Iwa shinobi's voice. He supposed that he could have tried to stop the man from revealing that the perpetrator of the massacre was himself, and avoided tarnishing how the genin under his command saw him. However, it was likely that them finding out about it was inevitable now that the details of the mission were out in the open. Either way, he was pretty sure their views of him would have been colored by the way the enemy ninja spoke of him. Kakashi-sensei, that's not true, is it? Again it was Naruto who was first to make himself known, his voice shakily betraying his shock at what he had heard. Out of all the genin he had seen that had graduated this year, Kakashi was certain Naruto was the most naive. It was hardly surprising that his sensei's son was so shocked. All Kakashi could do was explain himself the best he could, and hope that Naruto would eventually come to understand. I'm afraid so, Kakashi replied steadily, carefully keeping his emotion out of his voice. It was during a war that had already been going on for such a long time, and so many had died. Kakashi stopped dead, midway through his sentence. Several eerily silent seconds went by, until Kakashi managed to lock onto what had distracted him. A deep rumbling sound coming from the top of the canyon, that had been so quiet that it was nigh on inaudible, was slowly increasing in volume, almost as if it was coming close and closer to the edges of the canyon. A few more seconds passed and the Jonin noticed that all three of the genin had noticed the sound too. Kakashi could feel the vibrations in the ground now, growing ever stronger as the seconds passed. Kakashi-sensei, look at the top of the canyon. What the hell is that? It was Shikamaru who spotted the source of the noise first, as Kakashi hadn't dared to take his eyes off of the pair of shinobi in front of him. Still keeping his senses sharp for movement from the enemies to his front, the Jonin turned his head just enough to get a good look at what was causing the growing vibrations and sounds, that were now loud enough to seemingly shake the entire canyon, causing the looser rocks on the canyon walls to loosen and fall. And as Kakashi's eyes fell upon the object of Shikamaru's question, he felt his hand instinctively reach for his hitai that was covering his left eye, and one his greatest assets as a shinobi, and lifted it, revealing his pupil to be a deep red, with 3 tomo within the iris. The rumbling had stopped, and standing faceless, silhouetted against a skyline lit up by the moonlight, were the stone figures the group had passed on their way through the canyon, their swords now aimed threateningly towards the group of genin and the jonin they stood protectively around. The statues were leaner than they were before, Kakashi noted, probably adapted by whatever just you the pair of Iwa shinobi had used in order to animate them in order to allow for faster movement. Of course, it was impossible to be able to tell exactly how mobile these things were just by their size, but it was foolish to rule out the idea that they may well be as mobile as an actual person, and it wasn't totally uncommon to see objects animated in such a way by some kind of jutsu. However, how shinobi such as these were able to come by such techniques, given that jutsu such as these tended to be incredibly complex, as well as chakra intensive. The men in front of him were definitely jonin, judging by their chakra reserves, but one would have to have reached a level Kakashi was not sure even he himself had reached in order to use such a technique to the scale being displayed. Which, he deduced in the split second he had been pondering this, indicated that they were working for a considerable more powerful enemy. The possible consequences of that particular realization would have to wait, however, as Kakashi had more pressing concerns. The statues were moving again, one by one crouching, bending at the knees. He was on the move in the same moment that he realized what they were about to do, determined to get back closer to his team, and into a better defensive position. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Distracted by the arrival of the stone figures, he hadn't noticed Eiji slip back into the rocky ground. Kakashi ground to a halt, only having made it a few meters back, as the missing nin emerged from the ground in front of him. Come now, Hitaki. Your fight is with us. There's no getting past me. I can move faster in the earth than even that vile eye of yours can follow. Kakashi glared at the man standing between him and the comrades it was his job to protect. No getting past you, Kakashi asked, in the nonchalant tone he had perfected over the years. In that case, looks like I'll have to go through you then. Kakashi retorted, his glare not receding as he bought a kunai to bear. And on another day, you might well achieve that goal, Hitaki. The man began, the smirk on his face becoming larger at Kakashi's response. But, today the question is not whether you can get past me. It's, can you make it past me before those genin standing behind me have been ground into dust? And, as Eiji finished, the very first statue impacted with the ground behind him, after jumping from the very top of the canyon, splintering the earth beneath it. The statue turned to the group of genin, even as the others followed, shaking the entire canyon as they hit the ground and causing a cloud of dust to almost totally covering their considerable presence, and once again raised its stone sword towards the shell-shocked genin. Naruto was the first of genin to recover, and had instinctively reached for his weapon, maneuvering himself so that he was between the statues and Hana and Baki, whilst waiting for the dust to clear. He had never expected his very first mission to turn out like this, especially as he had already done a fair amount of reading into how missions were ranked so that he would have some idea of what to expect when he started taking missions outside the village. But now, he found himself, a totally inexperienced genin in the midst of what was a certain A rank. He knew that, given what himself and Shikamaru were about to face, at least until Kakashi-sensei could reach them, there was an incredibly high risk of getting seriously injured, or worse. Yet, he couldn't find a trace of fear within himself. All worries were replaced, partly, by a combination of surging adrenaline, and the will to survive. But most importantly, he was filled with the realization that, given his teammates' abilities, the chances of them surviving, at least until the Jonin made it past the missing Nin, relied totally on him. He absolutely couldn't fail, and that didn't scare him. He wouldn't allow his teammates to die. He wouldn't allow the people he now considered friends to be hurt, even if it cost him his life. That was a promise. And no matter how much he had matured since the days he would proclaim his promise to be Hokage from the rooftops of the village, Uzumaki Naruto never, ever broke a promise.